Hey guys, welcome back to Fix It Friday. So it has been a little while since I've had a video out, and firstly I just wanted to apologize for that. My personal life has been really busy, and so as a result I just haven't had time to make videos, but things have finally slowed down again and I'm really happy to getting back into the groove. So what I'm going to be doing today is actually kind of continuing off of the stuff I was working on about a month ago, which had to do with this little board right here. So this is Red Herring 32's OpenTendo Toploader project. What this is basically a modern recreation of the original NES Toploader motherboard. So what's really awesome about this project is that it opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities. One thing you can do with this is you could build a Nintendo from scratch using as many modern parts as possible, and you could use that to potentially resurrect a dead Toploader, just like this one. You could also hopefully in the future be able to take a Frontloader Nintendo and carry over a lot of those parts and convert it into a Toploader Nintendo, which is also nice. People really like this design because unlike the original Frontloader, games always work. You know, you just put them in here on the top, it always loads. You don't have to deal with that stupid 72-pin mechanism, which is unreliable and annoying to deal with. So yeah, it's a really awesome project, and I was really grateful to be part of the beta testing phase of it. So what I have here is probably the final release candidate for the Toploader, and so what I'm going to be doing today is combining it with this little board right here. This is the NESRGB by Tim Worthington. I've talked about it all sorts of times on the channel, and what it does is it allows you to have other video modes apart from just RF on the Toploader. So you'll get composite, S-video, you'll get RGB and component. So it really significantly improves the video quality that the Toploader can do. So I've had this thing broken in my pile of parts for no joke like 5 years now, and now thanks to this project I'm going to be able to resurrect it. So let's go ahead and build a Toploader Nintendo from scratch, test it out, and then once we know that it's working, we're going to go ahead and add in the NES RGB. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so I have the OpenTendo motherboard ready to go, and I'm going to start building this thing. And just like any of these other projects, the best way to do this is to start with the shortest components and progressively go with the taller and taller components. So as you can see here, I used the bill of materials and ordered a ton of parts. Most of these are passive components like resistors and ceramic capacitors. And so what I'm going to do is start by soldering all of those in at once. And so I'll be using the bill of materials, and you can see every position has a label, so like C30, R4, R5, and I'll consult the bill of materials and populate all of these at once. And then I'll bend out the leads on the bottom so that all of these components stay in place, and then go point by point and solder everything, and then just proofread my work after it's all done. So I went through this in a little bit more detail in the last video, which I'm going to link to in the description. So in the interest of time, and because I have a lot more to do this week, I'm going to go through this part a little bit faster. So right now I'm just going to go through a quick soldering montage, get the resistors, the ferrite coils, and the ceramic capacitors out of the way, because that's actually a fair amount of the board. All right, so let's get down to soldering. Okay, so now all of the passive components have been installed, and now we're going to go ahead and install a few parts that I extracted from the Toploader. But it's also important to note that pretty much none of these parts are special to the Toploader. You can also find them on a Frontloader Nintendo as well. So we've got a bunch of diode arrays, and these are for the controllers. So we've got these DAN 601s and these UPA diode arrays, and so I yanked these out of my broken Toploader board, but again, you can get these also from a Frontloader. They're exactly the same. There's also these two transistors, and as before, they're on the Toploader and the Frontloader. So they have an orientation, so you can see that there's like a circle and also a notch on these diode arrays, and so that indicates like, let's just say, the front of those parts. And you can see on the silk screen there's a square via, and it's also squared off, and so this is the front of those diode arrays. The resistor array, which is also over here, has a dot, and that has a orientation too, so the dot is going to go right over here. Now we've got these transistors here, and they have a notch, and the notch is going to go on the square via on Q1 and Q2. They're not the same. They're two different types of transistors, so don't switch them around. We've got a crystal oscillator, which goes right here, and then we've got the trimmer capacitor, and that's going to go like this, with the flat part facing the front of the board. All right, so let's go ahead and get these parts installed. All right, so the next step is to install a bunch of sockets onto the motherboard, and this allows me to very easily troubleshoot in case something goes wrong. And it also allows me just to replace chips if they ever go bad in the future, or just if I feel like doing testing or what have you. So there's a number of different chips on the board. Most of them are off-the-shelf parts that you can still buy. The exception, of course, is the CPU, which is a custom chip, and also the graphics chip, which is known as the PPU. So I have this dual wipe socket here for the CPU, and then I have this precision pin socket here, and this is for the PPU, and that's because this is perfectly suited for the NESRGB install that I'm planning to do. What else can I tell you? The only other part that's hard to source is the RAM chips. So there are modern replacements, but they are kind of tricky to find, and those are listed in the bill of materials. But if you have a Toploader NES, you can of course pop those out, but there's also the smaller form factor 6116 RAM that you can find in some front loaders, and that will also work in this case as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and install these sockets, and we'll be back with some more. All right, so we are getting to the end, and now I just have a few of the larger components to install. Now, most of these still have to be pulled from a top loader. For example, this controller port, you can only find this particular design on an AV Famicom or a top loader. There isn't a company out there that makes this. But that being said, I think some kind of 3D printed solution or adapter could be used to work with the modern NES controller ports that you can buy on places like eBay or AliExpress. The power switch is also pulled from the top loader, and this could probably be sourced on a place like DigiKey or Mouser. Really, you just need like a single throw switch that's a similar size and height so that it can be used by the shell, the plastic button that connects up to this thing. One thing I will say, that if you're doing this installation, you should definitely use something like ChipQuick to remove the switch, because it's a bit sensitive. Like if you use a lot of heat, you could potentially melt this component or break it in some way. I've actually done that with another switch on a different top loader. And so I learned by mistakes with that one. And since then I've used the ChipQuick because you can pull it out a lot faster and not use nearly as much heat. This is the reset switch. It looks a lot like the one used on the Nintendo 64. I haven't yet tried whether I can take one from a 64 and put it into a top loader, but it's more or less the same thing. And I think there should be modern parts that are like this. Maybe just has to be the same height so that when the plastic button pushes down, it actually actuates the switch. This is a bridge rectifier. These thankfully are common, and same is true for the 7805 voltage regulator here. And then this is a common mode choke, and this is the one that comes from the top loader itself. And I think you can find similar sorts of parts like this on DigiKey or Mouser. I just haven't found one yet that's like a perfect match. And then finally, here's the RF modulator. And I am installing this, and that's because I don't want to just add RGB right away. What I want to do is make sure that the OpenTendo itself works before I go ahead and put all the time into the RGB install. So those parts are going to go in next. And as you guys can see, the board is really starting to shape up nicely. It's mostly populated now with all the big stuff. It's just a few more components and we're going to be almost ready to go. Okay, so at this point, all of the components have been soldered into place with the exception of the cartridge slot right here. And what I added were the electrolytic capacitors, which as you can see, they all have an orientation. The negative side is indicated by a stripe on both the component and also on the board. We've got the bridge rectifier here, which does have a positive leg, which is a little bit longer than the other three legs. And it's marked right here on the board and also on the component. We've got the common mode choke, the power jack, and I have this temporarily soldered in for the initial test. And aside from that, all of the other major components are good to go. So I'll just talk a little bit about the cartridge slot. So this is an original cartridge slot from a top loader. And I think the ones on the AV Famicom are similar, except that those have 60 pins instead of 72 pins. The way that they work is that they have individual pins like this. So actually when you desolder the slot, it's pretty tough to pull these out, and oftentimes these little pins will remain on the board. Now that's not a big deal because they are removable, and to put them in, you just put them in with the bend facing towards the center like this, and it just falls right into place like that. And then you might just need something like these pliers just to kind of push it the last bit, and it'll just lock in like that. Now, if you look at the top over here, you'll see that they all line up and they're all as far up as possible. So if they're not all the way up, they might not make good contact with the pins on the cartridge. So this piece is going to go right over here, and just push it down, make sure it slides in, and it does. And I'll go ahead and solder that in, and that's really the final step. Before I do that though, I also wanted to show you, I have this Chinese knockoff of the same component. These are very inexpensive. It was only like $1.30 from AliExpress, and it got here pretty quickly, but they are definitely a lot shorter. They're about half the height as the original ones. I will be experimenting with these in a future build, but I'm not really sure if they're going to work, just because the quality of this is not as good as the original, and it's also not quite as tall. But, you know, all that being said, it might still do the trick. All right, so let's get this last little bit in, and then we're going to give this thing a test. All right, so the top loader is fully assembled, and I've got it all plugged in and ready to give it a test. And I've got to say, I really like this blue PCB. I mean, it just looks so nice. Much nicer, I think, than the black one that I did when I was testing out prototypes of this board. So yeah, I am about to start installing the NES RGB, but before I get to any of that, we just need to make sure that the top loader itself works. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Oh, yes. Oh, that's beautiful. That is just a sight to behold. Nice. All right, so it worked the first time. That's great. So there weren't any mistakes, and it just booted up. So let's go ahead and just test out a game really quickly. Yeah, there we go. Awesome. I love this game. It's really hard, but it's got phenomenal music, and that just kind of keeps you going. Journey to Silius, definitely check it out. All right, so yeah, it looks like everything is working correctly here. So I'm gonna go ahead and just put it through its paces a little bit, and as long as I'm satisfied, then we are going to move on to the NES RGB installation. All right, so now that we've gone ahead and confirmed that the board is working, we're gonna move forward with installing the NES RGB. Before I get to it though, I'm gonna just address something really quick, which is that some of you might be thinking, well, why don't you just redesign the top loader and just have all of this stuff embedded in here? And there's a couple of problems with that kind of approach. One is that, I mean, if you look at this board, it's really crowded. I don't know where exactly you'd find a place to put all of this stuff on the board. So especially considering someone's already designed a RGB solution for the Nintendo, it's way easier to just add this to an existing board. The other thing too is that, as you can see here, there's a lot of surface mount soldering. All of that is pretty challenging, especially for a beginner. And the cost of it would also increase this whole project pretty significantly. So I think for a variety of reasons, it makes sense just to add RGB if you feel like it, and if you don't, then just have a stock top loader experience. Okay, so with that out of the way, what we're gonna do first is we have to build up the top loader version of the NES RGB. And to do that, what we have is an adapter board, which is gonna sit basically like this and go straight into the motherboard, and then it shifts everything over to the you know, down this way a bit, just so that, you know, it doesn't, so that it fits inside of the case. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna build up the NES RGB first. There's gonna be a socket installed as well, which is gonna go just like this, and that's where the PPU is going to live. And then I'm gonna use these pin headers that come with the adapter board, and they're gonna go in this row of sockets, of vias rather, right here and here. And then finally here on the adapter board, I'm gonna use these precision pin headers and use those so that this thing will fit snugly into the top loader motherboard. So I'm just gonna go like this, and then solder these guys into place. And then finally, we're going to combine the adapter board and the NESRGB. There's a very specific order to do these things, and if you mess up, you actually can screw yourself in terms of installing this thing properly. So let's go ahead and build these two boards and then join them together. Okay, so the NES RGB board is more or less assembled at this point, and so you can see you've got the adapter board underneath, and it just shifts over the NES RGB a little bit so that everything fits inside of the shell. You'll also notice that I closed a bunch of jumpers. So you close this jumper J3 for power. This jumper J5 is closed if you have an NTSC American or Japanese console. And then I've got J1 closed because I'm going to be using button combinations to change palettes and reset the console. And then I have J10 closed because I want the de-jitter circuit to be active. This just helps improve the overall image stability with an NTSC console. So this is all ready to go. And so the next step that we're going to be doing is basically creating a Super Nintendo multi-out harness. So I have this little PCB here, and I'm not sure if it's visible on camera, but basically we're going to wire in about 10 wires that give us all of the various video and audio signals that the NES RGB can provide. So we'll have composite, S-video, RGB, sync, 5 volts ground, and then dual mono audio. So all that's going to be set up, and then we're going to use this 3D printed mount right here for the Super Nintendo multi-out. Once that's all set, I'm also going to be wiring up a couple of other things on the underside of the console. So just flipping it over really quickly, I have this little PCB right here from Voltar, and this enables expansion audio on the Toploader. So this means that you can use certain Japanese games like Castlevania 3, and they have extra audio channels, and you can take advantage of that on the Toploader using this little PCB. So we're going to mount this here, and we're going to send a wire from this little pad here over to this small little via that's right next to J5 right here. So that'll take care of our expansion audio. And then in order to do our in-game palette swapping and resetting, we're going to be setting up a couple of wires over here on controller port 1, and also soldering in a wire right here on the reset switch itself. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of that and then just explain everything once it's all finished. Okay, so the NES is starting to look like this big mess of wires all over the place. But trust me, there is a method to what I'm doing here, and I'm going to go through each of these connections and explain what they do. So right over here, we have 2 wires soldered in on these resistors, and these are used to tap sound. So normal NES sound comes from the CPU on pins 1 and 2 right over here. And since we can't really connect to that because the CPU is socketed, what we're going to do instead is connect to these 2 resistors right here. So this blue wire here, that's going to go over to pad A on the NES RGB, and then this green wire here goes over to pad B, and the NES RGB is going to do all of the audio mixing for us. So that's how we're going to tap in audio. All right, so now let's just flip over really quickly here, and what we see here is controller port 1, and you can see that I've soldered 3 wires to the controller port. So this is the clock latch and data lines for controller port 1. This is so that we can do button combos to change palettes and reset the console. So you can see I have those 3 connections made over there. Right over here I have this yellow wire. This is going to be used to tap into the reset, so that way we can use a button combo to reset the console. And then finally over here I have the Voltar expansion audio PCB added to the bottom here. So this connects to pin 51 on the cartridge slot and this point right here. And what you have is a 1K resistor going between those 2 points, and then a 47K resistor connected over here as well to pin 51 and then going out. So this is exactly the same kind of setup that's used on the front loader, but the pins are much closer together, and so a completely different sized PCB is needed. But it's a really nice, elegant way of making these connections. So yeah, then I've got this wire here. So this is going to go to this little via right over here next to J5, and yeah, right there. And so this expansion audio is going to get mixed in with our regular CPU sound, and then if we're playing like Famicom Disk System games or games like Castlevania 3 from Japan, we'll get all of those extra audio channels added in. All right, so that's all of those connections right now. And then finally, we have the Super Nintendo multi-out connector right here. So this follows the same kind of logic of a standard Super Nintendo multi-out. So we've got our RGB, which is red, green, and blue right here. This white wire here is for sync. We've got our ground. On this side here, we've got our brown wire here is Luma. I'm sorry, the white wire, gray. You can't even see it. But there's a gray wire here for Luma. This brown wire here is for Chroma. We've got this peach colored wire here for 5 volts. We've got yellow for composite, and then we've got mono sound with this purple wire here at the end. So I have the wiring diagram for this. I'm going to just put it in the description of this video so that you can follow along that way. And so I'm going to use the 3D printed mount, and this is going to basically sit right here, and you can use a Super Nintendo multi-out to get all of those analog video signals. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and just partially reassemble the console, and then we're going to just do the final connections, and then this thing is finally going to be done. All right, so all of our wiring is now complete and we are ready to give this thing a test. But yeah, before I do that, I just wanted to go over all the connections that I made. So these 3 wires here are the clock, latch, and data lines coming from controller port 1, and they just route all the way over to these pads here, which are labeled clock, latch, and data. This yellow wire here, this goes from the reset button all the way to this point, and that lets us do the in-game reset. It's hard to see, but this like peach colored wire here, this is going over to the little via next to J5. That's our expansion audio coming from Voltar's board. And then this bundle of wires here, this is all coming from the Super Nintendo multi-out and giving us all of our various analog video signals. And then here's the port, and as you can see, it looks really nice. And it's not exactly a perfect color match, but it's, you know, close enough to give us something that looks pretty good. And finally, here's the finishing touch. We've got our shell, and this thing is finally working, at least I hope. All right, so let's go ahead and plug it in and see how it looks. All right, so I've got everything plugged in, and I've got my SNES RGB cable going over to the open source scan converter, and just power, controller, etc. Let's see what it does. Ah, that's nice. All right, there we go. This thing is finished. All right, so let me pick a game, and we're gonna test out some expansion audio first. So I will do Gimmick. That's a great choice. That's perfect. All right. So As you can see, the RGB looks really sharp. It's a huge upgrade over the RF, and even the composite video coming out of the NES RGB looks really good relative to stock composite from, like, say, a Frontloader, for instance. So what I'm going to do right now is just go through the palettes, and so let me just pause this again. So if I hold the select start buttons and then hit the right button, I can toggle through 6 different palettes that are built into the NES RGB. The default is Firebrand X's Digital Prime palette, which in my opinion is the best one for the NES. So if I just hold right and select start, I can default to that palette. And as you can see, it looks gorgeous. Now, if I hit select start A and B, I should be able to reset the console, and that'll bring me back to the EverDrive menu. And yes, that works as well. All right, so this thing is finished and it looks unbelievable. And I have to say, I'm really happy to see this project come to completion. I've had this broken top loader in my parts bin for about 5 years now, and I've always wondered whether I would actually do anything with it. And I'm so happy to see it now finally working again after all this time. All right, guys, so that's it for this week's video. If you like this kind of content, then consider subscribing to the channel. I'm going to try to get back into my regular routine of having a video out every week. And then, of course, if you've got a console that you need repaired or modified, you can always contact me directly at oneuprestorations.com. All right, guys, thanks very much for watching, and I will see you next time.